Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Ever since UFC 279, where Khamzat Chimaev defeated Kevin Holland in the first round, people have been speculating what's next for Khamzat Chimaev. And I did a video immediately in the aftermath of UFC 279 speculating. I gave you guys a list of potential opponents for Khamzat Chimaev in his next fight. But I believe I finally know who Khamzat Chimaev is fighting next and when Khamzat Chimaev will fight next. And I have an entire theory behind it. We're going to get to that in a second. But before I even get into anything, I'm going to save you guys the suspense. I believe we will get Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit, and I'm even going to give you an early prediction. But Khamzat Chimaev has, in 2 years, become one of the biggest stars in the sport. And now, not only is he one of the biggest stars in the sport, he is now ranked within the top 5 of the welterweight division. I mean, that is absolute insanity. I believe he's currently ranked number 3 in the UFC official rankings. And for the longest time, we were saying he's beating up trash cans, this and that. That is not the case anymore. He has a win over Gerald Meerschaert where he KO'd him in the first round. Not the greatest win, but that win has aged very well. Then after that, he defeats Li Jingliang. And, you know, that's a solid win within the welterweight division. That's a natural progression. Then he goes out there and has a fight of the year contender this year at UFC 273. And he beats Gilbert Burns. I know there's some people that think Gilbert Burns won, or maybe it was a draw, or whatever they may think. Khamzat Chimaev showed that he could compete with the elite of the elite in the welterweight division. And I believe that he won that fight 29-28 against Gilbert Burns. And then, you know, he was supposed to fight Nate Diaz. And what that Nate Diaz fight was, one, it was the UFC punishing Nate Diaz for refusing to sign a contract extension, but also it was a keep busy fight for Khamzat. The UFC, after Khamzat got a win over Gilbert Burns, they decided that Khamzat Chimaev was going to fight for the title. Well, unfortunately for the UFC, at UFC 278, Leon Edwards pulls out a Hail Mary KO win in the 5th round. And now we have Leon Edwards as a welterweight champion, and we have to have Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman 3. You know, Kamaru Usman, dominant champion for a while, gets KO'd in the 5th round of a fight that he was winning. It's going to be a huge fight, and they have to make that fight. So now Khamzat Chimaev is in a weird spot because it was going to be, I think the UFC's plan was Usman beats Edwards, or even if Edwards were to beat Usman in a dominant fashion, or, you know, win in a way that people couldn't say, oh, well, Usman, you know, this or that, and complain about it and saying they want to see a trilogy fight. I think that if Edwards would have won dominantly, they would have done Chimaev versus Edwards for the title. But now we're in a situation where we have to wait till early next year, February, March, or April of next year to get clarity within the welterweight division. And you look at Colby Covington, there has been a massive myth behind Colby Covington. So his last fight was at UFC 272. He headlined a pay-per-view against Jorge Masvidal. He beat him. It was a fairly dominant performance outside of getting hurt badly, I think in the 3rd round. I can't remember which round it was. And it was a dominant performance. And Colby Covington has already fought for the title twice against Kamaru Usman. But now Colby Covington has newfound life because we have a new champion in Leon Edwards, if that remains. We don't know if that's going to remain or not. But Colby Covington is still in the top, 5 of the rankings. He's currently ranked number 2 within the welterweight division. And, he's in a spot where who is Colby Covington going to fight? Because there has been a myth going around that Colby Covington cannot fight because of his legal issues. Jorge Masvidal sucker punched him at a restaurant, supposedly, and because of his legal issues, he's not able to fight. That's the myth that has been going around. Nobody with any credibility has ever said that. Colby Covington has never came out and said that. Colby Covington's management has never came out and said that. Dana White of the UFC has never came out and said that. I don't know where that rumor got originated, but nobody with any credibility has ever said that. Not that Dana White has credibility, because half the time he says something and it's not true. But you get the point. And recently, I think it was like a month or 2 ago, Dana White came out and said that Colby Covington is looking for a fight. And I speculated on my video after Hamza defeated Kevin Holland that I thought Chimaev versus Covington just made perfect sense. And you look at the division and you look at Colby Covington. What could he want within the division? There's 2 things that fighters look for in a fight. They look for a big payday, the biggest fight they can find, and they look for a title fight. If Colby Covington fights Khamzat Chimaev, I believe that's the biggest fight in the division. Honestly, I think Khamzat Chimaev is a bigger star than Kamaru Usman or Leon Edwards. I mean, I don't even think that's debatable. Really don't think that's debatable. So that's the biggest fight that Colby can currently find. And on top of that, even if Kamaru Usman wins back his belt against Leon Edwards, I think a win by Colby Covington over a absolute savage like Khamzat Chimaev would garner him a third title shot. You know, the first fight was very competitive. He eventually got stopped in the 5th round. The second fight was very competitive. Some people even think it was a draw. It was a very competitive fight. And I believe the vast majority of fans would take no issue if Colby Covington fought Khamzat Chimaev, who's looked like an absolute savage and has just looked unstoppable, if he beats him, to give him a third shot at Kamaru Usman. But even, who knows, Usman may not be able to get his title back from Leon Edwards. If Colby is able to beat Chimaev, then Leon Edwards is able to defend his belt against Kamaru Usman in the trilogy. Colby Covington could get a title shot against Leon Edwards. So this fight makes perfect sense for Colby Covington outside of the fact that Khamzat Chimaev has become the boogeyman of the welterweight division. And I know, there was the whole debacle at UFC 279. Khamzat Chimaev missed weight. And he missed weight by something like 8 pounds. And people are saying he needs to go to 185. And he's fought at 185 before. I believe, from my understanding, Khamzat Chimaev was 4 or 5 pounds away when his body started to shut down. And, under the advice of doctors, I'm not giving him a cop-out. It's still unacceptable that he missed weight. His coaches decided to tell him to stop cutting weight. So I don't think he flat out missed by 8 pounds. I think he put some of that weight back on when he stopped the weight cut in the early morning hours of the day of UFC 279 weigh-ins. And, I know there was articles circulating around because Khamzat Chimaev tweeted out 185 with some emojis. I mean, Twitter, you can use it to help you make educated guesses, but I really don't think that means much. I mean, Khamzat Chimaev retired. It was earlier this year or middle of last year? I think it was middle of last year. Yeah, he retired on Twitter or Instagram last year. It's just, people just send stuff out. They generate news, and then, it could mean something. It could be meaningless. So you look at that tweet of about 185 pounds. I don't think that's super likely based on the UFC's advice, which I'm going to get to in a second. But then also, now he puts out a tweet that says at Colby Covington next. So he tags Colby Covington. And while I still say, this could mean something, this could be meaningless, I will point to the fact that he's been calling for a Colby Covington fight for what seems like a year now. He was calling for a Colby Covington fight before he even fought Gilbert Burns. And, you have the whole storyline from back in the day where he was supposed to fight Leon Edwards before he even fought the Leech. And Leon Edwards was ranked like number 2 at the time, and Khamzat wasn't even ranked. So he's been calling out Colby Covington for a long time. I think the fight makes perfect sense. And Dana White, at the Dana White Contender Series Scrum, was asked, what's the headliner for UFC 283 in December? And Dana White, as typical Dana White, kind of played coy, and he was asked specifically whether or not it be Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira, and he laughed. And that could mean something, that could totally not mean anything. And the other thing he was asked at the press conference, what's going on with Khamzat Chimaev? Is he going to be forced to move to 185 pounds? And there was a lot said there, but basically the summary of what Dana White said is, we're going to let Khamzat Chimaev decide. And there was one notable thing that he did say. He said if he wants to go for the title at 170, that's fine. If he wants to go for the title at 185, that's fine as well. And, I know that could be interpreted as, he can fight for a title in his next fight. I don't think that's the case. I think the Dana White and the UFC look at Khamzat Chimaev as one fight away from a title fight in either division. Whether it's fair in the 185-pound division, he's not ranked currently. But you look at the landscape of the division, Alex Pereira, if he is not able to defeat Israel Adesanya at UFC 281, it's slim picking for contenders. So I think Dana White's looking at the division and they're saying, you know what, Khamzat Chimaev could get one win and we could give him a title shot. I mean, Alex Pereira, he got one win within the top 10 against Sean Strickland, and that's the only win in the top 15 that he has, and he's getting a title shot because of the backstory, because Adesanya has cleaned out the division. So what I believe will happen, and here's my theory, I believe that the originally talked about Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 fight for the light heavyweight title will be moved from UFC 282 in December. It will be moved to UFC 283, which is in January in Brazil. So Glover Teixeira will get a title fight in his home country of Brazil, because I don't think, Davison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno 4 will be a main event of a pay-per-view. I just find that hard to believe. And what I believe will happen is UFC 282 in Las Vegas in December will be Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington for the #1 contender spot in the welterweight division. And I've been a person that has complained quite a bit about, worthless, non-title, main events of pay-per-views, aka Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz, and also Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal. I know some of you guys are probably thinking, well, these are literally the two guys you've complained about being in pay-per-view main events before. I think this is a lot different. The Colby Covington-Jorge Masvidal fight, I didn't find it all that interesting. I didn't think it had any title implications. And outside of the backstory, I don't think it deserved to be a main event. The Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz fight was just a fight for retribution against Nate Diaz, and they just wanted Nate Diaz to get smashed. It was a non-competitive fight that was not even relevant to the division, because Khamzat Chimaev earns nothing with a win over Nate Diaz. Now, if Nate Diaz would have beat Khamzat Chimaev, who knows what would have happened, but the fight wasn't super relevant, and the chances of that happening were so minuscule that it was it was not going to happen. So, you look at those two fights, I think they are vastly different, even though 50% of the fighters that are in those fights are the ones that are in this fight that I'm, speculating on. But you look at Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. This is two top 5 ranked welterweights, two guys who are in title contention, two guys who are arguably in the primes of their career, a stylistic, amazing matchup. I mean, who would not want to see Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington? If you do, let me know in the comments, because I can't believe that anyone would not want to see that. And I really believe with Colby Covington's draw power, I don't think he's this massive star some people make him out to be, but people do care when he fights, whether you love him or hate him, or you just respect his skill set. People want to see Colby Covington fight. And Khamzat Chimaev, I believe, is a few wins away from becoming one of the biggest stars in MMA. I really, truly believe that. And so why not book this for a 5-round main event? I mean, if you're going to have Khamzat Chimaev headline a pay-per-view versus Nate Diaz, it's a no-brainer. Why not have him headline a pay-per-view against Colby Covington? If you're going to have Colby Covington headline a pay-per-view against Jorge Masvidal, same thing. Why not have him headline a pay-per-view against Khamzat Chimaev? It makes perfect sense. It's a huge fight. And you start looking over the divisions, because you need another main event. If you don't have them as a main event, who else is going to main event? Conor McGregor's not main eventing. He hasn't even been tested by USADA in 2022. He's still recovering from his leg injury. That's a whole nother story, and I have a video on that I'll link down below. But you have Davison Figueiredo as the flyweight champion. That's not going to happen. He's fighting at UFC 283 in Brazil. You have Aljamain Sterling. He's fighting TJ Dillashaw at UFC 280 in a couple weeks in Abu Dhabi. You have Alexander Volkanovski, who's available, and that is available for a possibility maybe against Josh Emmett or Yair Rodriguez. Volkanovski has made it very clear he wants to fight the winner of Oliveira versus Makhachev. Then you have the lightweight champion, which technically doesn't exist, but it's Charles Oliveira. He's fighting Islam Makhachev in a couple weeks at UFC 280. You have Leon Edwards, the welterweight champion. He's fighting Kamaru Usman in probably February, March, or April of next year. You have middleweight Israel Adesanya. He's fighting Alex Pereira at UFC 281 in New York. And then you have Yuri Prochazka, which I talked about, which I believe he will be fighting Glover Teixeira in Brazil at UFC 283. And then you have the heavyweight champion, Francis Ngannou. From all hints that we've gotten from everyone, he's not going to be fighting this year. So then you have the other fight where you have Jon Jones versus Stephen Miocic, which has been speculated about, because Amanda Nunes, Carla Esparza, Valentina Shevchenko, none of them are headlining a pay-per-view. It's just not happening. So the only other option you would really have is Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. But I believe that was only going to happen if it happened in like September or October, because now you're getting to a point where Francis Ngannou could probably return in February or March or maybe even April. So why wouldn't they hold out and make Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones rather than you have Ngannou ready to return in maybe February? You would have Jones and Stipe fight in December. Who knows when they could fight again? They might be out for 6 months. So then you're in a scenario where you have a champion in Francis Ngannou who doesn't have an opponent. There'd be no logical contender outside of maybe Curtis Blaydes, who's already lost to Francis Ngannou twice. So the only possible option, if Yuri Prochazka does not versus Glover Teixeira 2 does not happen at UFC 282 in December, would be Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. And even if I'm wrong, and even if Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 does go down at UFC 282 in December in Las Vegas, I believe the co-main event will be Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington, or at the bare minimum, it will be Khamzat Chimaev versus someone. But I really believe Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington will happen in December. As far as an early prediction for this fight, when I look at this fight, I look at Colby Covington's wrestling, his pressure and his volume are his main strengths, and his stamina. And I look at Khamzat Chimaev, his biggest strength is his wrestling. And, Khamzat Chimaev, I think, has a little bit better striking than Colby Covington. I think he has a lot more power than Colby Covington, and I think he's bigger than Colby Covington. So I don't think that Colby Covington will be able to go out there and take Khamzat Chimaev down. Now, I'm not saying I don't think Khamzat Chimaev will be able to go out there and take Colby Covington down, but Colby's stand-up is predicated on the threat of the wrestling. People were worried about his takedown, so he ends up outstriking him. He's not a better striker than Jorge Masvidal, but Jorge Masvidal was terrified of the takedown, so he was able to put that volume on Jorge Masvidal. He's not going to be able to do that against Khamzat Chimaev. Khamzat Chimaev is not going to be worried about Colby Covington's takedowns, and Colby Covington doesn't have power. So Khamzat Chimaev has no reason to really respect Colby, and I think the only path to victory for Colby would be hoping that Khamzat Chimaev gets tired, because Colby Covington definitely has the stamina advantage, even though I believe the talk of Chimaev having bad cardio, is a myth. I think that it will cancel each other out on the feet. I think Colby Covington will have to try to take Chimaev into deep waters and maybe be able to finish him in the 4th or 5th round. But my official early prediction will be Khamzat Chimaev. I'm not sure how I think he wins. Probably by stoppage. I just think he has the better striking, and I think he has a size advantage and a power advantage, and I think he's not going to be worried about letting his hands go, because he's not going to be worried about the takedown of Colby Covington. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Again, I think Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington, main event in December, UFC 282, and I believe Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 will be the main event of UFC 283 in Brazil. Let me know what you guys think about all this. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.